Hello and welcome to the TR Talk Show, Therapeutic Recreation, Recreation Therapy, Neuroscience, Research Psychology, Role-Playing Games, and Music Therapy, and other related topics. We are tweaking the settings here. Okay, that's not working. Let's try that again.
Take two. Again, the website is trtalkshow.com with all the resources that you will need to participate in the live chat, email conversations, etc. And reminder, we are looking for special guests and co-hosts for the show. If you would like to be on the show as a guest or either a semi-regular or regular co-host, we request that you have extensive background in TR, preferably a CTRS, though not required. It is, especially if you're retired or something, but we really value those with extensive experience and the certification, etc., to give the feedback. I've been involved with therapeutic recreation since 2004, and I'm also a Washington State Department of Health registered recreational therapist, located here in Spokane, Washington, though I do provide services around the world through both remote services and mobile facilities. Have the wheelchair accessible trailer and bus that we take around the continent and such. Today's topics for episode number 4, this October 8th, 2019, we are going to cover brain-computer interfaces and their use in therapeutic recreation therapy, BCI Games Jam event that's coming up, also related an electroencephalogram bio-neurofeedback, open source EEG hardware and software, BCI in recreation and games in general, also role-playing games, using EEG to validate observed immersion scale with other data, the Wendy's role-playing game and the mainstreaming of role-playing games, which again we use as a modality as part of our therapeutic recreation programs, as well as music and other standard TR activities. RPGs becoming more mainstream, but also a little bit of the backlash against that, which happens in many industries when you take a hobby and turn it into semi-pro and professional and an industry, a maturing industry, which is relevant to TR with its struggles to become a respected and more well-developed professional industry. Some highlights from a wonderful conversation I had with Thomas Blaschko, the president of Idle Arbor, and we'll be talking related to that regarding assessment tool development. The various tools that we're working on developing currently, the observed immersion scale, the OIS, using EEG, as we talked about, to validate immersion and flow state experiences in recreation and games, activity assessment tool development, and the problems with the current ones. We've talked about that a little bit. We'll go into a little bit more and give a latest update on our development efforts. Player style assessment tool development, and any related topics. Now, again, we welcome audience members to join and post questions and answer real time, any topics you have, or you can post after the show or email trtalkshow.com for topics you would like to see on the show and have discussed. So today's episode is largely motivated because I also am on the RPG Talk Show, and we have a couple of researcher meetings on Sundays and Tuesday mornings with the research staff over at the nonprofit RPG Research. And we have, I work with researchers in Saudi Arabia and several other continents around the world. And one of our researchers actually here in Spokane is part of an effort to raise awareness about brain-computer interfaces. So there are many different types of brain-computer interfaces, and they really are a wonderful tool for improving accessibility in life, in recreation, and in daily life. And one wonderful example of the use of BCI technology is the BrainPort. Some of you may already be familiar with this as part of your TR training and just being in the industry is all. And what's interesting about the BrainPort, it's also related to the wonderful features that we have learned in recent decades about the neuroplasticity of the brain. It's really quite remarkable, and it's such a radical shift from older thinking about how the brain functioned. So it used to be believed that, so if somebody had a brain injury, the old way of handling it, even just 30, 50 years ago, was put them in a quiet room, don't disturb them, don't agitate them, keep the lights low, and just let them be and let them recover. And unfortunately, it turns out that was almost the worst thing you could do. I mean, you know, they still handled the medical, immediate medical needs and such, but as far as getting the brain to recover the most from a brain injury and having a better long-term prognosis, that was, it turns out to be very counterproductive. It turns out, in order to really engage the full effects of neuroplasticity theories about the ability of the brain to rewire itself and adapt to changing stimuli and such, you need to, within the realm of their level of fatigue and functioning and such, get them using as much of their brain as possible as soon as possible. This is really critical to a better long-term functioning, especially after that 2 to 3 year kind of plateau, and both in the short term and in the long term. So what you want to do is once they start coming out of whether induced or otherwise coma, and they start to orient, even if they've still intubated and such, that you start engaging their brain as much as possible. They may not be able to do a lot of physical things at first if they're in intensive care initially. You'll want to get them doing that as soon as you can, but you can certainly start engaging their brain early on. Now, there's the usual orientation quizzes, and then if they're intubated, using eye blinks, hand squeezes, or other interfaces to figure out their responses to see where they're at, oriented ×3, etc. But you can also take it to another level. And I've got a whole video about this, about a 20-minute lecture on using, for example, role-playing games to help with the recovery of a TBI client. It's an amalgamation of multiple clients' experiences into one hypothetical client. And it gets them imagining, as they're imagining, visualizing things, and they're responding through binary question and response. It's lighting up the brain, it's rebooting parts that may have shut down out of protective mode, and then the areas that have organic damage, it'll start to try to reroute other areas. For example, I don't know if we talked about on this show, but on other shows, the example for people who've lost their speech capabilities because it's damage to Broca's area. So if they can't understand things, that's Wernicke's area, and that's a different story. But if it's Broca's area and they're having trouble with speech, what they have found is that the singing part of the brain is different than the normal speech part of the brain. And they have found through the wonders of neuroplasticity that people can still sing when they can't speak. So even if there's organic damage, they can sing. And then through practice, they bring the sing-song, I am singing to you, down to a little bit less sing-songy and a little less sing-songy until finally they're speaking in what sounds like relatively like speaking. They're speaking, but they're using what was the singing part of the brain. It's really amazing. Check out those studies. It's a wonderful example of the power of this. So the brain port is another example of the amazing adaptive power of the brain, where and brain-computer interfaces, where sensory information can be sent to the brain through an electrode array which sits atop the tongue. It's actually on the tongue. And it's kind of like a Braille type kind of interface on the tongue. And at first it's just like, well, wow, that's a weird sensation, and it doesn't do you any good. And this will even work for somebody, you can learn to do it even without a brain injury, just with practice. Just like you can learn to read Braille without being visually impaired, you can do so with this brain port. So you learn to recognize, you slowly develop more and more sensitivity to figure out different configurations and signals that are being sent. And eventually you start to recognize the patterns. And as those become recognizable, and then you're able to interpret with the meaning of it, just like with Braille and such, you're able to orient yourself in your environment. So at first it's going to be very large features, and then you can get more and more granular. This is really amazing feature to give people who have visual impairments the ability to have a little more freedom and independence and be able to move about. And what's amazing is that the brain can start rewiring so that they can start having more of an imagery type effect. It's not 100%, but it is really quite amazing how the brain will rewire. This is assuming that the damage, the organic damage, has not affected the occipital lobe. But even if it has, there's other workarounds and such. But if they don't have occipital lobe damage, it's more their eye or nerve and in between and such was destroyed, there's potential there. It's quite remarkable. Really do check that out. So that's called the brain port. And there's some neat studies about that. Well, so that's a type of brain-computer interface. Others you might be more familiar with would be electroencephalogram, EEG type equipment. You've got all the little electrodes hooked up, and you're reading different brainwave patterns. And let's see, and I had those links handy. Where did I just put that? Okay. So with, oh, no, I don't have all the links on that page. I'll have to add those. I've got the topics, but I haven't posted all of the links that I have associated with this. I will work on doing that while I'm juggling the show here, if you don't mind me multitasking. We're still getting the hang of this particular show because it's a little bit different format than some of the others. So there's a number of them. So I wrote a paper some years ago, just a simple, straightforward one, about a fellow who was badly incapacitated and not able to move and communicate pretty much at all, limited eye movement, and they were able to hook up a BCI, brain-computer interface, in conjunction with virtual reality. And over time, they were able to move around in this VR setting and increasingly do more and more granular activities, including being able to basically type. And this is someone who was a software developer who was able to start writing software development code again, just using their thoughts. It's amazing. I've been involved with neuro and biofeedback actively since about 2004, 2005, as a client even earlier back in the 90s in bio-neurofeedback, but as doing some experiments and such since the early 2000s. And one of the examples is I was working with a specialist, and we experimented with playing musical instruments and seeing how that would affect an EEG-based neurofeedback video game, whether it's a very primitive video game that gives you reinforcement through feedback and such on if you're meeting the objectives in your brainwaves. So if you're having enough focus, or you've lowered your anxiety, or you've raised your energy, whatever the goals are, you set the parameters of the brainwaves, and then the game responds accordingly when you're closer and closer to the parameters that you need to be between. And then there's a lot of research out there about how music and such is supposed to help in a lot of areas. This was an interesting way to experiment. So there's playing guitar and playing flute. I'm fairly proficient in both. I can play them with a fair amount of automaticity. I can be playing the instrument while doing other things simultaneously. And so we experimented, and we found that while I was playing an instrument, it actually was able to enhance my focus, even though you would think that the distraction of multitasking, because that is really multitasking, I'm focusing on the game and this, or having a conversation or giving feedback, which normally would interfere, but with the playing the music and such, which I do on a daily basis, I literally use guitar I play guitar to fall asleep and such, actually enhanced my efficacy with the neurofeedback game. So lots of cool stuff related to that. And we'll get in a little bit more detail in the future. Well, one really exciting thing that's coming up, this is a wonderful way for you to learn more about this, is the upcoming Brain-Computer Interface Games Jam event. You should definitely check this out. The website, it's a little long, and again, I'll have it here on trtalkshow.com shortly. I'll get it posted even while we're doing the show here. So this is all under episode 4. So so like scratchy, itchy, itch.io/jam, J-A-M, /BCI, brain computer interface, -game-jam. So again, itch.io/jam, /BCI-game.jam. And you can sign up to have some level of involvement in this. So they're bringing together a bunch of BCI games and demonstrating and just trying to raise awareness about the wonderful capabilities of this with games and BCI. So that is coming up on I think it's November 8th. So November 8th, it's several days. So from November 8th at 10:59 p.m., I believe this is in Calgary or somewhere in Canada, through November 10th, 11 p.m. So November 8th, 11 p.m. basically to November 10th, 11 p.m. So check that out. There's that website to go to. You can sign up. And the goal of it, so I'll read it to you, is this game jam is motivated by the hundreds of children who, until recently, may never have been able to play a video game before. As BCI technology grows and matures, it will continue to enhance the lives of children and adults who have lost significant motor functions. This game jam aims to push the available experiences offered by BCI to new levels for these individuals. We all cannot wait to enjoy the wide variety of gaming experiences you will create. So people are going to be coming together, pooling their resources to help grow this. They're providing a Unity asset which exploits the P300 BCI control scheme. They've got an FAQ that explains that. And if you prefer to use another engine, that's fine. They don't want to limit your creativity. Use what you want. But you need to design your game such that it can be played with a single button input, preferably a key input. You want to keep it nice and simple. So, requirements for the BCI Game Jam. Your game must either use the provided P300 Unity tool or have a single button control scheme. The Game Jams focus on providing some great new experiences for children of all ages, so please keep your games appropriate. The games will be rated by a panel of children who routinely use BCI devices and their expert judges. And they will be answering questions as best they can throughout the Game Jam. So you'll be able to tune into their live chat and stream of the event hosted at the University of Calgary, Canada throughout that weekend. So definitely check that out. So I've been experimenting with BCI stuff and EEG related stuff for about 15 years plus. And you can find a lot of that over, because I've done it more through the RPG research side, although now I do it in practice as well. So you can learn more about those experiments and the papers that I've been talking about over at rpgresearch.com and go to the research section, and then you can go through the archives and read that. I have used the BCI interfaces in different settings, working with brain injury and other special needs populations. But as far as experiments, so far they've been limited to doing them upon myself, with other certified professionals, or by myself, just experimenting with open source EEG equipment. Yes, there actually is open source hardware in addition to software. So this is a very interesting thing that a lot of people don't know about. And it also will tie in when we talk later about improving the assessment tools that are out there in recreation therapy, and trying to validate them better. You know, a lot of what we do is considered soft science, and the hard sciences poo-poo all of the theories and research that's done in the soft sciences. But thanks to neuroscience and brain imaging and other objective measurable equipment, we're able to start invalidating, validating, and proving a lot of the theories and concepts and ideas. So if you want to check out the OpenEEG equipment and software that's available, there's a great website for that. I've used them on and off for many years. It's openeeg.sourceforge.net. And they have all sorts of wonderful info on both commercial and open software and commercial and open hardware. So one of the products, man, I need to grab that for the show. I'll try to do that next week if I can. Somewhere, I'm still unpacking from the ATRA conference, even this much later, from the bus and the trailer. Somewhere I bought years and years and years ago, boy, it's been almost 10 years, I think, from Olamex, modular open EEG equipment. And let me see if I can pull it up. I'll pull it up on a browser here and then try to share the screen so that you can see what I am talking about. And it's a 5-channel EEG monitoring equipment. It's made out of Europe. Oh, darn it. That's not what I wanted. What the heck? Open EEG. Oh, it's a site that's taking advantage of typos. Not nice. All right. Let me go ahead. I'll move this over and I will give you a shared screen here. I got to add it to this because I didn't have it set up in this particular profile. There we go. So now you can kind of see it when I show you the images and such. By the way, I'm broadcasting using Open Broadcast Server, OBS, and a lot of other hardware and equipment here in the studio. So this is the site, OpenEEG. That's the GNU. It's interesting, the logo that they have for that. And so if you scroll down to hardware, they talk about the different modular EEG, passive electrodes versus active electrodes, etc., calibrators, things like that are all very important. And you get a whole section down there for software. So one of them, of the manufacturers that you can buy from, so that you don't have to build it yourself, because a lot of this is building it yourself to create custom boards. But you can go to the Olamex site, and in there they have a whole OpenEEG section with these boards that you can buy. These are in euros. And then one that's fully assembled for you. So this is what I have. I bought some years ago. It's a 5-port. Let's see. So you can't see the mouse in there. That's too bad. But it's a 5-port system with a USB out. And I don't think it has, okay, here we go. So you can see the guts of it inside, etc. So you can see on one side is the USB out port, and then you have 5 in ports. But you'll notice there's one port by itself. So you have the 4 in a row and one by itself. That one by itself is, by default, is passive. All 5 of them are passive. Excuse me a second. But that one can be set to active. And that's where we get into transcranial stimulation, transcranial induction, etc. And you want to be very careful with the active settings. So some of you are probably already familiar, if any of you work in the medical division of TR, with TENS. Used for back injuries and other products like that. I have a whole slew of injuries. I was in a wheelchair briefly in 2004 due to multiple knee and back injuries. I went through 5 years of physical therapy, and I had to pay a lot because they had very expensive equipment for TENS, which is the transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation equipment. And now you can buy it for 60, 80 bucks at a local Walgreens or Rite Aid or other pharmacy or online. And it's just little pads that are electrodes you attach, and it's electrical stimulation. Bruce Lee was famous for doing that not long before he died. There were some people who hypothesized that may have contributed to his death with aneurysm and all that. That's questionable, but I think that's been disproved. I think that's in line with the other people who have conspiracy theories about the Lee family and all that. Anyway, that's a tangent. But he used it he would really crank it up so it caused the muscle contractions, so he thought it gave him a much faster workout and such than he could do normally. And he was in incredible shape, right? Generally, you don't use TENS in that way. What you use TENS for is to stimulate the nerve and blood flow and get everything going. So it helps with speed up the healing process, but it also kind of numbs the nerves in a non-medication way. So instead of having to medicate your whole body to get to one area that hurts, it's a localized way to deal with pain. And it can be pretty effective. A number of uses in a day can relieve pain for hours. And now I have chronic pain. I live with pain all of my life because of my spinal cord and knees and such, cartilage damage, etc. So I'm never below, on a scale of 0 through 10, I'm never below a 2 or a 3 for any length of time. And with the TENS, I can have I can get down to a 1, where there's still a little bit there, but and 2 or 3 you just get used to. But on the days when it's a 4, 5, 6 plus, it really helps, and I don't have to take a lot of medication. Some of the medication I used to take all the time for the injuries started causing trouble with kidneys. There's all those side effects that you get from medication use. Now, there are dangers with active induction. You don't want to put it near the heart. You don't want to put it around the brain because it can do all kinds of bad things. So one of the things related to that, it's not electrical, but it is related to the active type interfaces. I tend to, because of my background in teaching automotive and electrical and computer science and such, I use the term induction a lot, but it's transcranial magnetic stimulation. Sometimes I accidentally say transcranial magnetic induction. And also known as TMS, also known as repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation for different purposes. And what's really fascinating about this is it represents, you can control which parts of the brain start and stop and such through a three-dimensional targeting. I mean, you can wave a wand and do all kinds of math stuff, but now they've got three-dimensional ones where you can, instead of having to cut out a piece of brain or drill a hole and stick an electrode in to like stop a seizure or something like that, they can temporarily stop a part of the brain through this magnetic stimulation, and you can experience blindness, you can experience all kinds of things, you can experience euphoria. It's very fascinating, the different effects. So it's great experimentally, but it's also turning out to have some potential treatment uses. So these are all related to just some really fascinating aspects of the brain that tie in some way to TR, and we're going to focus mostly on the BCI and EEG aspect, but you can see how it can go really far afield, and I've got lots of blog postings, essays, and such on my other websites about that if you're interested in going deeper into the rabbit hole. So back to the Olamex thing, this 5-port one. I have not used the active port. I have not used this on clients or research subjects. For research subjects, it requires, to use the active port definitely is going to require an institutional review board oversight, because at that point you are trying to change something and there may be the potential risk for harm. In the passive mode, I have used it with clients just as a monitoring mode and such, but I haven't used it in neurofeedback. I have been debating going and getting certified in neurofeedback equipment application. There's a number of options out there, and I am seriously considering that. I've got some other things I got to wrap up first, so it probably won't happen anytime real soon, but I am thinking about adding that to my long list of certifications and such. But in an experimental setting, we would need institutional review board oversight. We have partnerships with different universities through the RPG Research Organization, and I'm hoping that by next year or the year after, but maybe next year, it's looking promising, we might have that IRB oversight to do some controlled studies with EEG equipment hooked up to recreational participants, specifically music and role-playing games, because that's our focused modalities, but then you can extrapolate for other activities. And trying to find a more objective measure of immersion and flow state experiences. So in our list here, let me make sure I'm not skipping over. Yeah, so that will tie in with our development as we talk about assessment tool development, our development of the observed immersion scale correlated to other data. So I have over the years, in trying to optimize whatever the recreational activity is, trying to figure out how to do it the best way under the best environmental controls to get the greatest effect in the shortest amount of time. So again, I like to use role-playing games and music. We'll talk about role-playing games as an example, but you can extrapolate these techniques to other modalities. So back in 2010 to 2012, I had more than 100 participants in more than a dozen groups on every other week basis, coming in and participating in role-playing games. And they were different games, and I experimented with a lot of variables. Now, I wasn't trying to change anybody's health or mental health, any of that. I was focusing on participant feedback forms on their level of enjoyment, their reports of a depth of immersion, and whether or not they think they had a flow state experience. Those are the three main things I was trying to establish what the bits, the variables were that I could make those numbers go up and down on their self-report at the end of each session. And this has evolved into what I'm now calling the observed immersion scale. It still has a long ways to go, peer review, more experiments and such, to establish validity and reliability, but we're working towards that. Because the problem is, as far as I know, there are plenty of subjective reported immersion and flow state scales out there, many from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and such. But as far as I know, we haven't been able to find an observational one that's outside of the subject that can let you predict what the person's subjective experience is. So again, if you want to know more about Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and flow, and if you're a recreational therapist, whether you're a student or a professional, I am hoping you know lots and lots and lots about flow, since it's such a key part of doing rec therapy. And it is what I in practice, use as a measure. The more flow state experiences they have, usually, because that's an optimal state of learning, the more effective our educational and therapeutic programs tend to be. But if you want to know a lot more about immersion and flow and the foundation of positive psychology, the systems model creativity, these are the collected works. They're in 2 books. You can get these on Amazon. They're not too expensive, by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. The spelling is very funky because it's Hungarian. That's Mihaly for Mihai. Csikszentmihalyi, Cikkszentmihalyi, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. You can get these 2 books, and they're the collected works of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. They're great, a great collection. So you want to learn a lot more about flow state and his theories and such, definitely check that out. He's not the only person on it, but he is one of the kind of founders of flow state theory. And he has in here a number of the tools they use and the results of self-reported immersion and flow state experiences. I really want to try to find something more objective than that. It's great. As long as we can correlate the two, that's fine. But we want something more objective. This helps us as practitioners, therapists, educators, be able to, on the fly, adapt more quickly to our clients' needs. So, talking about the study back in 2010, 2012, I started noticing that I could start reading people's body language and interaction, both group and individual, and kind of get an idea of whether, and we all do this instinctively to a degree, right? We all, as social human creatures, except for those of us who have some impairments, can kind of read if somebody's having a good time or not, and if a group is having a good time or not. And as rec therapists, that's what we do, right? So I'd be observing this group, and then I'd see what their scores were at the end. I recorded all these sessions. I have years and years and years of video and audio footage, more than a decade's worth of game sessions and other activities, drum circles, and of course all these broadcasts I've been doing for years. And so I could go back through, I could be in it while I'm running the game and facilitating, and then I could go back and watch the videos outside of it so I wasn't having to juggle and really look at the details. And started to be able to see patterns that started to better predict how high a score they would give. And I was fiddling with the environment variables. So some of the environment variables, and all this is under RPG optimization on the rpgresearch.com website, included like room temperature, right? Setting the room temperature to 78 or 62 versus the 68 to 72 typical range. The lighting, changing it from better lighting to softer lighting, to harsh lighting, to colorful lighting, what have you. Noise, ambient noise, either the kind that can be tuned out easily or other more irritating noises, or street noises going by, all kinds of different stimuli and environment variables. And was able to, between all the different groups, start being able to say, okay, this variable to this extreme, typically across the group will lead to a 1-point loss in participant enjoyment on their score. And this will enhance. So another area was size of the group. So in role-playing gaming, tabletop role-playing gaming, the optimal size, which is generally what most role-playing gamers end up going to anyway, most game masters are experienced, end up settling to about 4 or 5 players. You have the game master as the facilitator, and then 4 or 5 players at the table. That's kind of the sweet spot for a game that moves fast enough that the turn taking isn't too long between each person's turn. And we, as rec therapists, we have that upper limit of 8 or 9, and for certain activities like that, we don't want to get too large a group. And as soon as you start adding another participant, so the 6th player, the 7th player, it's almost exponential increases in the reduction of the satisfaction level of the players and their reports of their immersion scale and their flow state experiences. So you start getting up there and it gets harder and harder for them to have a deep immersion, their enjoyment is less, and they're less likely to have flow state, which means you're now having a less effective program for trying to target your educational, therapeutic, and other goals. And so you could repeat these techniques with any modality. So with drum circles, it's a different story. We do drum circles with up to 50 people, 50 people, and it works fine, right? That's not the way drum circles work. You don't have to have the smaller group. And in fact, with drum circles, I don't know what the infinite limit is. I mean, because we've seen Evelyn Glennie do entire stadiums of drummers, right? Thousands of drummers is amazing. And I have no idea what their flow state experiences are, but we do know that a drum circle of 2 or 3, it's a little harder to get into. You can still get into a groove and such, but it's a little different. You feel more on the spot, especially people who are new and aren't very advanced drummers, or it's their first time. When you start to get a little bit larger group, when you start getting 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 people aren't feeling like they stand out as much. They can listen to the others and they can experiment without feeling as much embarrassment, which means they can get to that point where they start dropping that self-consciousness and worry and focus on the activity and enjoying it more, focusing on the facility, what kind of, or the facilitator, what activities are doing, etc. And then they have a more enjoyable time. So it's going to depend on the modality, right? Each one, you're going to have different numbers of participants that are going to affect efficacy. So you can use these same techniques. But it's really slow and tedious and doesn't give you a response in that moment of, I need to improve or change something to make this better because I can see these clients are not having a good time. Now, again, most of us can pick up people's overall cues, body language, facial expression, etc. Although when we work a lot with autism spectrum and others, Parkinson's, etc., where they have a very flat affect, and you can't tell by facial expression if they're enjoying themselves or not. You might be able to tell a little bit by body language, leaning forward, where their eye contact is, if they're responding to external stimuli, but it is much harder to read. The observed immersion scale tries to take all of these factors into account and try to more accurately predict. But even better would be the EEG type equipment that you could actually see when their brainwave patterns are in a certain range. Now, we don't have time to go over the 5 main brainwave patterns that usually are tracked for these types of services, for neurofeedback, etc. I do have, as I add the links, there are links about 5 brain waves and its connection with flow state and such. But the main ones are gamma, beta, theta, alpha, delta. Their different frequencies, what they're associated with, etc. You can check that out as I add those links. You can go read a little bit more about that. Or you can watch one of my researcher meetings that I just had a couple hours ago, and I go into great depth and conversation with that with some researchers and talk about it over on patreon.com/RPG research. That's behind a paywall initially for donation because they're a nonprofit, but after a month or so, that's made freely available to the general public. Anyway, with the observed immersion scale and assessment development, in order to establish validity and reliability, it's really helpful to have other tools that already have good numbers to see if your new tool jives well with the other tools. And especially if you're trying to make something that's a little faster, simpler, easier, you want to make sure you're not losing a lot of that validity and reliability. So let me straighten that a little bit. So we already did in early development stages of the OIS, recording audio and video of all the participants. We have the participant feedback forms and their scores. And then we have the game master doing their observational notes, etc., both during the session and then after watching the video. But now with the OIS, it starts asking very specific questions to answer and rating it on a very specific scale. And so now what's happening is we're now running it in community settings weekly, and I run the OIS, and then we see what their reports are after. And I'm trying to predict what their enjoyment levels are going to be. And it's getting pretty darn accurate in that if I say they had an OIS of 7, then everybody's going to report a 7 or higher on a scale of 1 through 10 on their enjoyment level. Generally, it's going to be 9s and 10s. And I'm still adjusting the scale, trying to figure out where it makes the most sense to have it. Initially, we started with basically about 4 or 5, kind of almost a Likert type thing, was the general average enjoyment of a role-playing game. but I'm trying to better correlate it to the participant feedback forms for predictability. So I might have to adjust that scale further, but it's a little bit tricky because I'm also trying to throw in flow state, and in the community settings that we don't really have a flow state evaluation because it's too complex a topic, because some of our participants are young as 4 or 5 years old. And so we're using smiley faces, frowny faces, etc. for their ratings. So it gets a little bit trickier. So right now, generally an OIS of 7 for the group, without getting into individual OISs, generally predicts that all participants will score a 9 or 10 on their enjoyment level. An 8 means everybody will score a 10 or higher. I say or higher because we've had participants from time to time, especially when we work with at-risk youth and others who come from really rough environments, who don't really have much experience with healthy leisure lifestyle and recreational activities. We'll say it's an 11 or 99 or 100 or 1,000, but they'll often write best experience I've ever had in my life. and it's a tearjerker to hear that from these kids who really struggle, don't eat regularly, abusive situations, etc. To be able to provide that to them is wonderful. And we've done this in school settings, community settings, and in private practice, both with contracts and elsewhere. And so whether or not those people have had a flow state experience, we don't put them through the same questionnaires with our practice side unless they're more mature, more along the teenager and adult side, and less with the at-risk youth. We don't want to bog them down with that kind of more research-oriented. We want to just keep them moving forward with the programs and seeing their productivity and how their behavior improves and all of that. On the research side, we do include questions to try to determine if they had a flow state experiments when we're doing the more controlled research. But right now, where the OIS is at till further adjustment and more peer review, again, 7, if I observe and I give a 7 to the group, that means nobody rates it lower than a 9 of their own experience. If I give it an 8, nobody rates it lower than a 10. But where's the 9 and 10 on that scale, right? So that's why I'm talking about still shifting it, because 9 is for when we do the research that everyone rates it as a 10 experience, and everybody checks off in one way or another that they had not just deep immersion, that they believe they had a full flow state experience, that everybody in that group had that on a limited basis, at least had one, everybody at some time had at least one flow state experience. And then the OIS of 10 is that everybody reports that they had extended flow state experience, either multiple flow state experiences or extended flow state experiences. And if they're able to estimate the time, look for the overlaps. But that's all so subjective. I'm wondering, and I'm hoping as I buy more of this open EEG equipment, and then we get permission through IRB and such, I want to see if when those self-reports of those 9s and 10s happen, and self-reports of flow state happen, if we can see that in the EEG reports. So there's some websites on this about brain waves and flow state, and so using that as a guide for the configuration settings that we want to set up. And remember, we use electronic activities, video games, etc. We use tabletop activities that are verbal. We use live action activities that are physical, and we do a lot of hybrids in between. And then, of course, we do music activities as well. My hope is someday, and it may be as soon as next year if I can find funding and keep training the resources up that I need, is next year that we will do a controlled study of people wearing a bunch of EEG equipment while doing the activities, and then over time, as they get used to the equipment and start tuning that sensory stimulation, which it takes them out of it, we start to get some real hard data. Until then, we've got various other areas, but that'll really help us dial in the OIS. And the OIS, while I'm focusing on role-playing games, should be applicable to any activity that you're trying to rate immersion and the potential for flow state. It doesn't measure flow state. It tries to measure their observed immersion. So here's part of how I tested it. I think I talked about this in a previous show. They'll be doing activity, and I think they're getting up around a 6. I will go walk past the table and see if they look up at me, if anybody looks up. Starting to get up around a 7, I'll go start opening and closing doors kind of noisily, making other noises, see if people are distracted by that even for a flicker of a second. The ultimate test that they're so immersed that they're likely to be in flow state is I'll literally take like a big heavy book, textbook, drop it on the floor somewhere, either carpet or tile or whatever. Tile's louder. Do the little boom. And there are participants in these role-playing game activities who the entire group will not look up. They will be so immersed in the activity, nobody jumps, nobody looks, not even a darting of the eyes occurs. And again, the community settings we don't have recording, but others we do. And they completely tune out that external stimuli. They are so in the group collective bubble of that activity, so immersed, so engrossed, that it seems very likely they're having a flow state experience. And in talking to them, it does indeed sound like that subjectively they were having it at that time. And so that's putting the OIS up around a 9, and then the OIS 10 is kind of a theoretical construct based on more research we need to do. I haven't been able to test an OIS of 10 yet until we can do more of these established controlled experiments with the EEG. So it's kind of a placeholder. Everything might shift a point or two one way or the other. It's gone through a number of shifts over the years. This is kind of where it's at right now. So this is all related to the discussion of assessment tools. And I had a wonderful conversation at the ATRA 2019 in Reno, Nevada last month, which we talked about a little bit, with Thomas Blaschko from Idle Arbor. That is one of the large publishers of TR books. Many of you will already be familiar with if you've been through any of the formal training programs, etc. One of the more common ones that I love to reference is the Red Book, is what we call it. Assessment Tools for Recreational Therapy Related Fields. This is the latest edition, 4th edition. I'm not aware of a 5th edition yet. By Idle Arbor, that's IDYLL space ARBOR. And it's Joan Burlingham and Thomas M. Blaschko. So wonderful conversation with Thomas at ATRA. He was very excited to hear that we were trying to work on new scales. And so we had a number of lengthy conversations, and he hopes that in the future we'll consider publishing through their resources. We'll see. I do have my own publishing organization. I've been involved with publishing for a few decades on and off, working in different fields. But he had highly recommended in our efforts to do this, because I've been frustrated trying to find a number of scales that don't seem to be either properly developed or to exist at all, like the OIS. He said in these efforts, I ran by him what we were doing and how we were doing it, and he thought we were totally on the right track, that that's exactly the approach they would take to develop the same scale. So that was wonderful to get that feedback from somebody so knowledgeable about that kind of development. I'm very, very thankful for that. But he had a book there I hadn't seen before, and I guess it's been around for a little while, but I just somehow had never come across it. And I posted repeatedly on the ATRA Oklahoma State email list asking for more assessment tools and such. But it looks like this was published in 2012 by Idle Arbor. So the green book now, similar style, by Monir G. Ragheb. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Mounir G. Ragheb, Argheb, PhD. It's Measurement for Leisure Services and Leisure Studies. This has a few more scales in it, but what it really has that's useful, so the Red Book talks about how to assess the reliability and validity of assessment tools, how to test that, and a high level of how to develop an assessment tool. And then it just mostly goes into lots and lots of assessment tools, and you can see I have this highly bookmarked from the many assessment tools we've looked at, and many of which we use, some of which we've had to reject because they've either they do not have good reliability and validity, either from the book saying so or from our own testing. But there's a lot of great ones in that book. If you need a collection, if you had to have a single collection of assessment tools for rec therapy, as far as I know, this is as good as it gets. But this is a nice kind of add-on to it, because it has some additional tools, but critically to what we're doing and talking about here and in our other research sessions is methods used to construct measurements. Now I've only got this last week. I'm juggling some other stuff. I'm doing some social gerontology work right now and everything, so I'm loaded. So I don't know when I'm going to have time to read through this, but I'm really excited and looking forward to going through this. So there's a number of assessment tools. We talked about this at a high level, and it looks like we're already running up on our time here, about assessment tools, which this is taught in a whole bunch of textbooks. The activity analysis step, right? It's part of APIE. Let's not get into the APIE discussion from last week. So here's another client assessment book. This is from Norma J. Stumbo. We've got this series from Heather R. Porter, which is an expansion of what we called the Blue Book before, but now it's a series of bluish-green books. Recreational Therapy and the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health, according to the World Health Organization ICF-ICD codes. Recreation Therapy Basics, Techniques, and Interventions. Recreational Therapy for Specific Conditions. Oh, there's one other here that's missing from the stack. There it is. Let me grab that. Luckily, I went wireless today. So these are all recommended. And then, of course, the cookbook. See anything else I can think of here? Protocol development. Okay, I think that's enough of the assessment, activity analysis related books. So then we have 8th edition from David R. Austin. This just came out recently. He specifically reached out to me when I posted on the ATRA email list suggesting a look at this. So 2018 from Sagamore Venture. Big, heavy book. It's soft cover, but it is heavy. It's 580 pages. The red book's 700 or so. Therapeutic Recreation Processes and Techniques, Evidence-Based Recreational Therapy. All right, and then of course the cookbook, Therapeutic Recreation Program Design, Procedures, Principles and Procedures, Norma Stumbo, Caroline Peterson. So all of these in some way reference part of the APIE process and assessment, and a key part of, this is part of the CTRS, the activity analysis phase. Then you have task analysis, etc. Task analysis is pretty straightforward. That's not a problem. There's a real problem with activity analysis and therapeutic recreation. I would really want to get some of you professionals with more experience. I've been in the industry for about 15 years, the TR industry, but there are many of you with far more experience and really want to get you on the show commenting about this. Again, I've had dialogue with a number of people through the ATRA Oklahoma State email discussion list, a number of people at the ATRA conference this fall, and I've talked to people over the years because as far as I can tell, there is no good activity analysis tool out there. So there are what is taught to everybody. So let me start here. I think it's in the cookbook here as part of the process. I forget which page. I pulled this out so many times. Okay, activity analysis, chapter 7, 176 in the cookbook. And right, this is part of what every rec therapist is trained, and and it's a critical part of doing recreation therapy. In theory, if we're doing this wrong, everything else we're doing is going to be wrong, and it's only going to be up to the individual to do it right. If our foundation is flawed, that's a problem, and this is a key part of that foundation. Activities should be selected carefully according to the behavioral requirements of participants and the activity's ability to contribute to the achievement of outcomes. Carefully selected. Now, rec therapists are highly intuitive for the most part. I don't know what the Jungian assessments and MMPR, PI, and other assessments are for rec therapists, but clearly there's a large part for those who go into his career of intuitive, empathic aspect. And so we become, for the most part, better and better, it is hoped, at seeing when a modality is working and not working for our clients. So that's kind of a gut feel thing. And it's not that that's useless, but it's not good for research and hard science and publication, and it means a lack of consistency of treatment for our clients, which to be respected as a good professional industry, we've got to have some way to have some level of consistent quality delivery of services. And I think this is a big part of why TR gets beat up so much, is because we have some foundational stuff that's still in trouble. We still haven't addressed. And again, please, I'm bringing this up for us to have a conversation as a community so that we can hopefully all be more aware and hopefully improve this as a community. So I had been using these examples throughout these books of there's an activity analysis process. So activity analysis, client assessment, then you decide the intervention programs. So I would have a spreadsheet full of data from all the assessment stuff from an intake client, and know where their functioning was, where it wasn't, and what our targeted goals were. And so part of the process is analyze the activity as normally engaged in the general populace. When completing the activity analysis rating form, rate the activity as compared to all other activities out there. That requires a broad tool set of knowledge already, and everybody's tool set is different. Analyze the activity without regard for any specific disability group per se. Then analyze the activity with regard to the minimal level of skills required for basic successful participation. Now, doing this myself in private practice and doing it elsewhere, it was not a problem as an individual therapist. I didn't have to worry about interrater reliability issues. This, from what I can tell, completely breaks down on interrater reliability across the board. And the more you get away from CTRS level training, the worse that gets. That's to be expected. But even those who all have the same training towards the CTRS don't all have the same activity training. So part of why I went into TR when I went into retirement when I was 33, because I did the whole tech thing and did the Silicon Valley thing, and I had that option, that luxury to look at a new career after my kids moved out, grew up and moved out just this year finally. I have a very diverse tool belt of recreational activities. I've always been a very high energy person. Even now with all my injuries and ailments and such that have happened to me, I'm still a lot higher energy than the average person, even with these things slowing me down and putting on weight and all that from the medication. I do a lot. And I have a low threshold for boredom. That's the ADHD part, certainly. So I've always wanted to be engaged in very active activities. I don't like being passive. I like being actively engaged. So I've developed a huge array of hobbies and interests throughout my lifespan. So when I went into TR, I wasn't thinking of role-playing games initially, but I was thinking of all these other things. I do hiking and survivalism and all kinds of crafts and hobbies and motorcycle rides, and I have an automotive background. I used to be ASE certified. All kinds of sciences, music. I play more than 20 instruments. Wide tool belt, right? So I have a lot of experiences to compare and contrast when I do the rating on the activity analysis. So when I would do an activity analysis by myself to figure out what activity was best and then looked at the variables between the two spreadsheets and do a cross-analysis matrix, I could get a pretty good picture of this activity done this way for this client is going to get the ideal, optimal goals met. I took the exact same activity analysis that other people have given me over the years from universities and other practices, from facilities, as well as my own, applied it to others who've been through the training and such, and where it holds up on a per question basis, these activity analyses seem to do pretty well if just a checkbox is required. If you're not using a Likert or other variable scale type, if it's binary options, for the most part, the interrater reliability is pretty darn consistent. So for example, what body parts are required, that's pretty consistent. What types of movement for the activities are required, that's pretty consistent. What are the primary senses required? More junior therapists kind of forget some of the other senses there. Once they've had a little bit of experience, they're usually pretty consistent about that. Social aspects, looking at the Avedon interaction patterns, which we've talked about before. The minimum and maximum number of people, that's a little bit more variable, but these still are fairly close. They're a 0.8 or better coefficient in interrater reliability. And as far as RPC research is concerned, as far as I'm concerned, the gold standard that we always want to try to be at a minimum at is 0.8 or higher. And below 0.8 still might be useful. It's certainly a promising indicator. 0.6 to 0.8 is not useless. That's still pretty good information, but it needs to be improved. Below 0.6, 0.4 to 0.6 is, well, there needs to be more research done, but there's definitely something there. And then 0.2 to 0.4 is, well, there's something, but we got a long ways to go before we understand it. And then below 0.2 is basically random. You might as well flip a coin. And sadly, you see published all the time on PBS and YouTube and NPR and people all excited because this research study shows a 0.3 or 0.4 correlation to this effect and this effect, this causality, etc., and this correlation, and that is not strong at all. And we see a lot of people, and the beautiful thing about the Red Book, love this about the Red Book, is it takes time to tell you, and tell you how they did it, and how much, and what the sample sizes were, the n size, etc., what the coefficients are. So for example, one of the ones we like, I think it's the LRM here. Let's see, get the right. Okay, that's the whole leisure battery. Here's the LMS. Let's look at the numbers on there. Yeah, let's go with the LMS. So leisure motivation scale. It has a nice summary page or two that you can just quickly jump to before going deeper. So suggested levels as far as level of functioning, they need to have an IQ of 8, adapted IQ of 80 or above, mental age of 12 years above, Rancho Los Amigos level of 7 or above, reality orientation level of mild to no orientation disability. This lets us know which clients are potentially appropriate. Interestingly enough, this is Jacob Beard and Monir Ragheb, the guy who does the Green Book. Tells you the time needed to administer on average, etc., how much to score it, etc. And then the reliability validity has a number of subscales. So under the intellectual subscales and cross-referenced, a 0.9 coefficient. Under social and social, 0.92. Competency mastery, 0.91. Stimulus avoidance, 0.9. That's a strongly indicated a tool, but we got to look at the sample sizes, things like that, because some of the sample sizes in here say like 20 participants as opposed to 120 participants, or sometimes they've done it over years and testing and retesting, and it's been consistent over all those years, and so they have a huge aggregate. So that's a better tool than one that has had one study of 20 participants. It is wonderful that this book gives you that info so you can make an informed decision as a professional on which tools you want to use in your practice. Well, there is no activity analysis as far as I can find. I haven't gone through the, let's take a look at the Green Book, but I don't think there's anything in the Green Book. There's nothing in the Red Book. And I've gone through all the other books who do have activity analysis templates, but none of them are complete. They're all partials. I've been emailed a few examples from people's professions that either they've done themselves or their facility provides, and they're all kind of partial. Even the ones that are supposed to be complete really aren't very complete, because, for example, we do modalities like music and role-playing, and the assessment tools don't include ways to determine which musical instrument or musical activity would be appropriate for this person's functioning. There's no questions in their assessment tool that would address that to give us an idea of which would be best. It gives us a general level from the other questions, but helping us differentiate with that modality, it's kind of lacking. And it's just a way of phrasing the questions and making sure it's all inclusive. With role-playing gaming, way off. There's a lot of stuff that's not asked that would help us determine which role-playing game would be the best one to use with the population. Now, we know from decades of experience, I've been involved with role-playing games since 1977, that No Thank You Evil is totally appropriate for ages 5 on up of all kinds of levels of functioning, and that Vampire the Masquerade would not be appropriate for 5-year-olds. Pretty easy. A lot of people could intuit that pretty quickly, but there's no assessment tool that you could do an activity analysis on all the different role-playing games out there, or just between those two, between No Thank You Evil. You could do the same, you would do an activity assessment on both, and you'd get the exact same results. And so according to your matrix, if you were to put this in a computer program, you would be saying 5-year-olds are okay to play Vampire the Masquerade. Gah! I think the only thing that would show up is maybe reading level would be problematic, but that's about it. So leisure involvement, leisure motivation. Yeah, I'm just doing a quick look here in the Green Book, see if there's anything about activity analysis, since again, I haven't had time to read this. But this is a real hot button topic, because again, this is so fundamental to what we do. Nope, nothing on activity analysis in the Green Book. So where it is covered is, again, in the cookbook. This is where lots of people are taught that. David Austin had recommended I take a look at his. I need to put a post-it in there, because he has a whole little section. It's not a lengthy section, but he does go into it and provide some examples. There it is, 217 through 220, and then 347 to 349. So 217, all right, I've got it folded over. Well, these are all great questions, but it's not really an activity analysis form. It's the interview questions that you would want to ask and put into a form, but it's not complete, right? And it's some great questions, and we take all that into account. Part of the process of developing a tool is find all available resources and start huge, and then narrow it down through redundancy and other things, and rephrasing the questions, finding what works best on a question-by-question basis. And then one or two of these other books also has activity analysis in it, but none of them are complete. And this is everything, and talking to everybody on the ATRA list, the ATRA conference, asking all around now. For about 6 months I've been asking around. This is all I can find, and then the emails have been sent to me. This is a core part of what TR is about, and we don't have a standardized, well-tested, one or more tools with any kind of established reliability, even just tested anywhere. What I can find is if you go to academia.edu and researchgate.net, a number, just in the last few years, a number of people have done studies on recreation therapy activity analysis and how incredibly flawed they are. And I'd already found that, again, the binary question ones tend to have a good interrater reliability of 0.8, 0.9 or better. But everything else, I had people rating on a scale of 1 to 5, so like simple to complex, quiet to loud, etc., anywhere from a 1 to a 5. I might as well flipped a coin. The coefficient was effectively 0. For just a number of different disciplines. When we get to just CTRS trained, it was still often, based on their age and experience and their tool set of activities, still at 0.2, 0.4. The best I've seen was 0.6, and that's it. That's not good. That's not good at all. So I have been having our researchers and I work together. We are trying to put together a decent activity analysis tool that's quite lengthy right now. We'll worry about shortening it when we've got it working properly and we've covered all the bases. Then we'll worry about trying to keep it above a 0.8 or higher, but shortening the duration and complexity of it. If you know more, please comment, please reach out to trtalkshow@gmail.com, comment on the video, etc. If you have resources with links to point to that you think would be helpful, please, please, please share that, and we will gladly share that with others through our Twitter and Facebook, etc. Going over here a bit, and I'm going to keep bringing this up because it's such a foundational issue. Let's see, let me make sure I didn't miss a topic completely. So some of the things other assessment tools we're looking at are genre interest assessments. So let's say you're interested in seeing if people like to read. Well, you need to know what genres they're going to like, and you might want to know what kind of story style they like. So a genre interest assessment tool is another tool we've been developing. And it's basically just a long list of different genres that are available out there, and it's a long one. It includes like biblical and all these other things. We want it to be as inclusive as possible. Right now it's too long. We're hoping we can shorten it without hurting its efficacy. But right now its efficacy is high. If people say they like this and they rate how much they like it, on a Likert scale, then we know which books to recommend or not recommend to them as far as from a genre perspective. But then there is reading style or play style. And there are some tools out there for play style. We've been trying to find better ones for role-playing game style, because that's a more complex activity than most. Role-playing games are such a complex, multivariate activity. That's part of the challenge with doing research in that field, but it's also, I like that challenge. So we've also been working on, there's 3 semi-established, fairly well-established play style assessment tools out there. They're all for video games. We've been trying to expand and adjust that to include video versions of role-playing games, tabletop versions, live-action versions, and hybrids, so we can get an idea of people's different play style, making sure it's applicable across all of them. We think that's going to make a better tool. And that play style assessment, while right now it's geared toward role-playing gaming, should be able to tell you about other activities. There are general play style assessment tools out there. There's a number of them, and some are better than others. But if you're trying to figure out what is the right video game or the right role-playing game or the right live action game for a participant as far as their individual style. So we already talked about an activity analysis that tells us what's appropriate to the activity for their level of function. Now we're going more individual, right? Let's say we go from a broader social phobia type thing, to now we're going to a more specific, that individual's personal tastes and preferences. It has nothing to do with functional level, it's just personal tastes and preferences. Well, that's what the play style assessment. So some people, if you use the Bartle taxonomy, which is heavily flawed, but is easy for people to understand, you would have people who are explorers, people who are socializers, people who are puzzle solvers, and people who are into combat. They call them killers, but murder hobos, whatever. But they really like the combat and the action. Those are quadrants that can, from the assessment questions, you can kind of figure out where they're leaning more towards and what they'll enjoy more. Because if you put somebody who loves to solve puzzles into just a social game, they may, and there aren't really puzzles associated with that social interaction, the sign language for boring, they're not really going to be that well engaged, and you're gonna have to. It's gonna be more trial and error, right? We want to reduce the trial and error of TR practice as much as possible here. So if you have a good, effective play style assessment tool, now you know much more specifically which game. We could say whether Dungeons and Dragons versus Doctor Who, between their genre interest and their play style interest, is going to be more appropriate when engaging them. So these are other tools we're working on, among others. There's some others out there, but that's some examples. So I hope that this conversation, well, right now monologue, but I hope it will trigger a conversation, you found helpful. If you're a student, I hope you find that you learned a lot of new things. If you're an experienced professional in the TR field or other fields, that you found these thought-provoking things. And if you have experiences that you either disagree, please, civilly, wonderfully welcome disagreement, suggestions for improvement, resources, etc. Please post them to the YouTube or contact trtalkshow@gmail.com. So that's it for episode 4. We had a pretty long episode today. Well, that's weird that, okay. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. This is episode 4. Again, October 8th, 2019. We'll be back again next Tuesday, 1 to 2 p.m. Pacific time. Again, trtalkshow.com for the links to our YouTube channel. Until we get to 1,000 views of our videos and such, we can't have a custom YouTube channel URL. They changed that whole process. So do please like the video. Whether you disagree or not, that's okay. But if you at least like that we're doing this talk show, whether or not you agree with the subject matter or opinions expressed herein, please like it and help spread the word, and let's get the views up. Then we'll be able to make it youtube.com/TR Talk Show or something like that. That's much easier to get to. Until then, you got to go to trtalkshow.com, go to live stream, and then there's a link. You can click there to get to the channel, because otherwise the channel is a really long random string. So I welcome your feedback and comments. And again, if you're interested in being a guest who wants to cover any of these topics or other topics you want to talk about, your upcoming book, your upcoming research, things in your own practice field, since there aren't as many researchers in TR as we'd like, but there's lots of practitioners. So if you have evidence-based practice, things you want to discuss, wonderful. We'd love to have you on the show. We're all about spreading the word about, so we are happy to advocate and promote things that are related to TR and help spread the word. But we're also going to be critical, right? As much as I'm a fan of TR, as you can hear, I also have my criticisms and worries, because I want to see the TR industry flourish. And it looks like, I've been watching 15 years, it feels like the last few years it's been floundering. It seemed like it was really, really doing well, and now it feels like it's occupational therapy is eating our lunch. I think they've been more organized. I think they've been doing a better job on marketing and lobbying. And I'm really worried with their recent expansion into recreation as part of OT about the harm that's happening to TR, and that we're not getting our act together. So, all these things, advocacy, research, evidence and practice, various practice problems, the social issues, biopsychosocial, spiritual, etc., all relevant topics. Would love to have you on the show, either commenting or as a guest. And I am looking for one or more co-hosts so that we can not have a monologue and have a more interesting dialogue of multiple people, experts in the field from different aspects of TR industry. So please do email trtalkshow@gmail.com if you're interested in that. Wherever you may be well, and happy therapeutic recreation.